On the 12th of June this year, without much fanfare, without a single dramatic headline splashed across the front pages, Europe quietly rewrote the rules for anyone fleeing for their life and hoping to find safety within its borders. 10 separate pieces of legislation, years in the making, became fully binding law across the entire European Union on that single day. And for the tens of thousands of Afghans still trying to reach Europe, still trying to escape a country now run entirely by the Taliban, that one date may end up mattering more than almost anything happening on the ground back home. Here's what actually changed, and why it's got humanitarian organizations across the continent sounding the alarm. The European Union's new Migration and Asylum Pact isn't a single law. It's 10 separate regulations working together, and as of this June, all of them are now fully in force. The stated goal, according to the European Commission's own language, is a system that's effective, fair, and firm. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen described it in exactly those terms, saying the pact delivers more secure external borders, more solidarity between member states, and more efficient asylum and return procedures. And by one specific measure, the EU says it's already working. Illegal border crossings, according to the bloc's own figures, have dropped 55% compared to 2 years ago. But that 55% figure is precisely where the disagreement begins, because a drop in crossings can mean very different things depending on who's being kept out and why. Human Rights Watch, in a detailed question and answer breakdown of the pact published just before it took full effect, didn't mince words about what they believe this new system will actually do in practice. Their assessment states plainly that the new rules will undermine the right to asylum by making it easier for governments to rush the assessment of protection claims, by limiting safeguards throughout the asylum process, and by increasing both the prevalence and the duration of detention for people seeking that protection in the first place. The single most consequential piece of this new system is something called the border procedure. And it's worth understanding exactly how it works, because it's specifically the mechanism most likely to affect Afghan asylum seekers directly. Under the new rules, any EU country now has to examine asylum applications from nationals of countries with an average EU-wide refugee recognition rate of 20% or lower using this fast-tracked border procedure. In practical terms, that means people arriving from certain nationalities can be funneled into an accelerated process, often involving detention right at the border itself, before they've even formally entered the country whose protection they're seeking. The entire system runs on statistics, average recognition rates calculated across the whole EU, rather than a full individual assessment of each specific person's own story and danger. Now, here's where things get genuinely complicated. For Afghan applicants specifically, because Afghanistan's situation doesn't fit neatly into that kind of statistical sorting system at all. According to policy analysis from the European Council on Refugees and Exiles, most EU member states, including Belgium, Germany, Greece, and France, currently grant full refugee status to the majority of Afghan nationals seeking protection, recognizing them as at direct risk if returned. At the same time, a smaller number of countries, including Austria, Germany, France, and Italy, still use a different, more limited category called subsidiary protection for some Afghan applicants. And several countries, Germany among them, have gone further still, offering a specific form of temporary national protection to Afghan applicants precisely because sending anyone back to Taliban-controlled Afghanistan carries such serious, well-documented risk. That patchwork itself is exactly what the European Council on Refugees and Exiles has flagged as a genuine problem, independent of the new pact. Their own reporting states clearly that despite an overall positive trend in recognition rates, the treatment of Afghan nationals seeking protection still varies considerably across Europe, with people continuing to face serious challenges, including long waiting times, depending entirely on which country happens to process their claim. Their policy recommendation is direct. The European Commission, they argue, should be actively investigating member states with unusually low protection rates for Afghan asylum seekers specifically, to make sure decision-making genuinely reflects EU and international refugee law, rather than simply reflecting which country a person happened to land in first. This is precisely the kind of inconsistency that becomes far more dangerous once a fast-tracked 20% threshold border procedure gets layered on top of it. If Afghanistan's overall EU-wide recognition rate sits anywhere near that 20% cutoff, even briefly, or in any given reporting period, entire categories of Afghan applicants could suddenly find themselves funneled into an accelerated, detention-heavy process, one explicitly designed for nationalities the system has statistically prejudged as less likely to have a genuine claim, regardless of what any individual person has actually survived to reach Europe's border in the first place. And the underlying facts about the danger of return to Afghanistan itself haven't gotten any less severe. The EU's own agency for asylum has kept detailed country guidance on Afghanistan continuously updated throughout this year, incorporating information right up through this past spring. Their most recent formal assessment cites, among other developments, ongoing conflict along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, including at the Torkham crossing, ongoing evidence used specifically to help determine whether individual Afghans still qualify for international protection. In other words, the EU's own expert asylum agency continues formally documenting Afghanistan as an unsafe environment for return, even while the broader legal architecture around processing those exact claims tightens considerably. There's also a specific, deeply consequential development worth flagging here, one that shows just how quickly conditions for Afghans seeking asylum can shift, and not only within Europe. In the United States, the government has stopped accepting new applicants through several parole and protection programs specifically created for Afghans, including the program known as Operation Allies Welcome, which had provided a pathway to safety for Afghans who worked alongside American forces and international organizations during the 2 decades of war before the Taliban's return to power. Afghanistan has also been placed on a list of countries facing full immigration restrictions to the United States, alongside nations like Syria, Somalia, and Yemen, meaning citizens of these countries currently face severe limits on receiving American immigrant or non-immigrant visas at all, with only narrow specific exceptions. That's a parallel closing of doors happening on the other side of the Atlantic. At almost exactly the same moment, Europe's own system is tightening, leaving fewer and fewer avenues open for Afghans, specifically who are trying to reach safety anywhere in the West. Back in Europe, humanitarian organizations are raising an additional, quieter concern buried inside the mechanics of this new pact, one that doesn't get nearly as much attention as border procedures and detention, but that experts say matters just as much for fairness: the quality and timeliness of the information used to actually decide these cases. The European Council on Refugees and Exiles has specifically called on the EU's asylum agency to ensure that decision-makers are relying on the most current, accurate country of origin information available, and has recommended that the European Commission actively commission independent fact-finding missions and reports from NGOs, academic institutions, and other independent sources, specifically to keep pace with how quickly conditions inside Afghanistan continue to shift under Taliban rule. Their underlying point is straightforward but important. A faster asylum system is only as fair as the information feeding into it, and if that information lags behind reality on the ground, faster simply means faster mistakes, not faster justice. So what does all of this actually mean, practically, for an Afghan family right now, today, trying to reach safety in Europe? It means arriving into a system fundamentally different from the one that existed even just a year ago. A system built around statistical thresholds and accelerated processing at the border, rather than one guaranteeing the same kind of individualized, unhurried assessment that previously determined so many Afghan asylum outcomes across the continent. It means a real possibility of extended detention simply while a claim gets sorted through that new fast-track mechanism, based not on that individual's own specific story, but on aggregate recognition statistics, calculated across dozens of different countries with wildly different approaches to Afghan cases. And it means navigating a landscape where, as ISRI's own reporting makes clear, your actual chances of protection can still shift dramatically depending on which specific European country happens to process your file. An inconsistency the new pact, according to its critics, does relatively little to actually fix, even as it makes the overall system faster and firmer in exactly the ways Ursula von der Leyen promised it would be. The European Union, for its part, continues to defend this new system as a necessary, overdue overhaul, one that finally brings order, consistency, and efficiency to a patchwork of national asylum systems that had struggled for years to manage the sheer scale of people seeking protection across the continent. And that 55% drop in illegal crossings is a real, measurable statistic that EU officials point to as proof the new approach is doing exactly what it was designed to do. But for humanitarian organizations who've spent years tracking exactly what happens to individual Afghan families once they enter these systems, the concern isn't really about whether the new pact is faster or firmer. It's about whether faster and firmer inevitably comes at the cost of fair, whether a system built around statistical thresholds and accelerated timelines can still reliably tell the difference between someone genuinely fleeing Taliban rule and simply someone whose home country's average recognition rate happened to fall on the wrong side of an arbitrary 20% line. That question, whether efficiency and protection can genuinely coexist inside this new system, or whether one is quietly being sacrificed for the other, is likely to be tested again and again over the coming months, case by case, country by country, as the full weight of this pact settles into place across Europe's asylum system for the first time. Watch how individual member states actually implement these new border procedures in practice. Watch whether the European Commission follows through on ECRI's call to investigate countries with unusually low Afghan recognition rates. And watch Afghanistan itself Because as long as conditions on the ground there remain as documented and as dangerous as the EU's own country guidance continues to describe, the real test of this entire new legal architecture won't be how quickly it processes claims. It will be whether it still gets the answer right every single time, for people who genuinely have nowhere else left to go,